The unconscious contains the seeds of future consciousness. When life falls apart, it rarely announces itself with thunder. It starts quietly, a slow, invisible unraveling. The job that once gave you direction now feels hollow. The relationship that once felt like home becomes a mirror of everything that's missing. Even the routines that use the ground you begin to feel like rituals of someone else's life. One morning, you wake up and realize that the map you've been following no longer leads anywhere. And that's when the panic sets in. Because if you are no longer who you were, and you don't yet know who you're becoming, what's left? This is the moment Carl Jung described as a dark night of the soul, the phase when the outer world collapses so that the inner one can finally speak. It's not a punishment. It's a summons. Something in you, the deeper, wiser self, has decided that pretending is no longer sustainable. What disintegrates on the outside is only a reflection of what the soul can no longer hold within. You might lose a job, the person, the certainty, but what's truly dying is the false identity that grew around them. The collapse is not the end. It's the refusal of your spirit to live in exile any longer. At first, you fight it. You cling to what's familiar, trying to fix what cannot be repaired. You tell yourself this is just a phase, that if you push harder, it will go back to the way it was. But the harder you fight, the louder the silence becomes. Until one day, beneath the noise of fear, you hear something different. A voice that doesn't come from logic but from the depths. Let go. It's not defeat speaking. It's wisdom. Jung once wrote, in The Nature of the Psyche, that the unconscious has its own wisdom, its own teleology. It moves with intention, even when it feels like chaos. What feels like destruction may be life's most careful surgery, removing what no longer belongs so that something living can take its place. Think of a forest after a wildfire. Everything seems lost, the trees, the color, the song of life. But beneath the ashes, the soil is transforming. The seeds that could never grow in shadow begin to break open. That's what happens when your world collapses. It's not the end of life, but the preparation for new life. The fire doesn't come to punish. It comes to clear the way. So maybe this isn't destruction at all. Maybe this is sacred disassembly. The world that's crumbling isn't being taken from you. It's being peeled away because it was never truly yours. The job, the title, the relationship, even the idea of who you should be. They were chapters in a book that your soul has finished reading. What's left now is a blank page, waiting for a new story that aligns with who you are becoming. And yes, the blank page is terrifying, but it's also pure potential. In psychology and religion, Jung explained that the experience of the numinous, that awe-filled encounter with something greater, often emerges only after everything familiar has been stripped away. That emptiness you fear might be the threshold where your true life begins. So maybe the question isn't, why is this happening to me? Maybe it's, what in me is trying to be born through this ending? Because endings are not random. They are initiations, the soul's way of inviting you into alignment with what's real. What looks like collapse is often the self saying, it's time. Time to stop surviving. Time to start becoming. And if this collapse isn't a failure but a calling, then another question begins to whisper through the silence, one that holds a key to everything that follows. If the collapse is part of your rebirth, how do you know where to begin again? Carl Jung believed that every collapse of meaning is not a failure of life, but the beginning of transformation. He wrote that the unconscious is always at work, rearranging what consciousness refuses to face. And in those few words, he revealed one of the most profound truths about human suffering. When life begins to fall apart, it isn't merely random misfortune. It's the deeper intelligence of the psyche initiating a sacred reconstruction. What the ego calls destruction, the self calls reorganization. The moment your old structures begin to crumble is the same moment a hidden part of you starts to awaken. For Jung, this was never pathology. It was process, an inner alchemy that transforms personality through the confrontation with the unconscious. The mind sees only chaos, but beneath it, something purposeful is unfolding. Like fire melting raw metal so it can be reshaped, the unconscious dismantles the rigid patterns that kept you small. In The Nature of the Psyche, Jung described this as a teleological movement toward greater wholeness. Every breakdown, every heartbreak, Every dark night is the psyche's way of steering you toward integration. Think of a seed buried deep in the soil. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening. Only darkness, pressure, and silence. Yet inside, the seed is splitting open, disintegrating so that life can emerge. To the eye, that looks like death. But in truth, it's the most sacred act of creation. You are that seed, your old identity, the one built on pleasing others, chasing validation and avoiding pain, must crack for something living and authentic to grow. The suffering you feel is not punishment. It's the sound of the shell breaking. The ego, however, resists this process with all its might. It clings to what's familiar, to old habits, relationships, and beliefs, even when they no longer fit. It tells itself, if I try harder, it will all go back to the way it was. But that is the voice of fear, not wisdom. The ego's instinct is to preserve, while the self's instinct is to evolve. And when these two forces collide, suffering is born. Jung compared this tension to the crucible of alchemy, the heated vessel in which base matter is purified. He understood that the purpose of this inner fire is not to destroy, but to refine. If you look closely, you'll see that life is always offering the same invitation, to let go of what has completed its purpose. When a chapter ends, it's not because the universe has turned against you. It's because something truer is waiting to take its place. But renewal requires humility. It asks you to stand unarmed in front of the unknown, to stop fixing and start feeling. As Jung once said, we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That's the essence of inner renewal, to face the parts of yourself you've ignored and to welcome them home. Every emotion you resist, every dream you dismiss, every coincidence you call meaningless, they are all messages from the unconscious. They arrive like whispers in the static of your daily life, urging you to listen. The unconscious doesn't speak in words. It speaks in symbols, through dreams, through synchronicities, through the subtle magnetism of life events. It shows you what wants to be healed. To the rational mind, these signs seem illogical, but to the soul, they are the most honest language there is. Renewal begins when you stop demanding that life makes sense and start letting it make meaning. But listening to the unconscious isn't easy. In the beginning, it feels like silence. You sit in meditation, journal your thoughts, or walk alone in nature, and all you hear is nothing. Yet this emptiness is not absence. It's preparation. Just as the soil must rest before it can bear fruit, the soul needs quiet before it can reveal its voice. The silence you fear is a space where the new self gathers strength. The truth is, every inner renewal begins with surrender. Not the kind that gives up, but the kind that opens up. When you stop resisting and start allowing, the unconscious moves closer to the surface. You begin to sense patterns in your dreams, feel meaning in your pain, and trust that something larger is guiding your unfolding. The collapse was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to reunite you with the parts of yourself you left behind. So remember, the key to renewal is not fighting the darkness, but understanding what it's trying to teach. The unconscious is your oldest teacher, your hidden healer, your forgotten ally. It has been waiting patiently beneath the noise of your life to show you the way back home. But that brings us to a question that every soul eventually faces, the question that determines whether the collapse becomes your ending or your awakening. If the unconscious is guiding this process, how do you listen when everything inside you feels silent? When your outer world begins to collapse, something profound starts to stir within. The unconscious, that vast unseen ocean beneath awareness, begins to speak, not in words, but in symbols. It moves through your dreams, your emotions, your body, your coincidences. A stranger says exactly what you needed to hear. A song on the radio mirrors your pain. A dream repeats the same haunting image. You start to sense that life itself has begun to whisper, "Pay attention." Jung called this the psyche's compensatory function. What the conscious mind denies, the unconscious restores through symbols. It compensates for imbalance. When reason becomes too loud, the dream reminds you to feel. When control takes over, chaos breaks through to free what's been suppressed. A recurring dream of being lost, for example, isn't a curse. It's a mirror. It tells you that the old maps no longer apply. That direction can no longer come from the outside world. It's the psyche's way of saying, your compass is turning inward now. Every image, every sensation carries meaning. Jung believed the unconscious doesn't simply react to life. It participates in it. It's always in dialogue with consciousness, offering symbols as bridges between what you know and what you've forgotten. Sometimes, those symbols appear as synchronicities, moments that feel too precise to be coincidence. You think of someone and they call. You read a line that describes exactly how you feel. These are not accidents. Jung saw synchronicities as evidence that the inner and outer worlds are woven by the same thread. When your conscious life breaks apart, the unconscious compensates by sending patterns to remind you that meaning is still alive. It's as if the soul, sensing your disorientation, begins leaving breadcrumbs back to itself. The unconscious is not your enemy. It's your architect. It contains the seeds of future consciousness. Jung wrote, and that means even in the ruins, something within you is already rebuilding. The new foundation is being drawn in silence long before you can see it. The confusion you feel is not emptiness. It's germination. Just as a forest floor looks barren in winter but hides 1,000 seeds beneath the frost, your psyche is quietly preparing the next season of your life. But here's the paradox. The unconscious speaks only in a language the ego resists. It doesn't speak in logic or certainty. It speaks in dreams, intuition, emotion, all the things we've been taught to dismiss. To the rational mind, these signals seem chaotic. But if you learn to listen, they reveal exquisite order. That sudden burst of anger may not be an inconvenience. It might be a message that a boundary has been crossed. That wave of sadness might be your soul's way of saying, something precious has been ignored. When the life you knew disintegrates, the psyche begins translating truth through feeling. The more you ignore those signals, the louder they become. Anxiety, fatigue, restlessness, they're not random malfunctions. They are, in Jung's words, messages from the deeper strata of the soul. Each one carries instruction, guiding you to release what no longer fits the life you're meant to live. You may not understand it yet, but every loss has its own dialect. The job that ended is saying, make room for purpose. The friendship that faded is whispering, make room for authenticity. The relationship that broke your heart is asking, make room for love that honors your wholeness. Loss is a language of renewal, the soul's most fluent way of making space for new meaning. So the invitation is not to interpret every sign with paranoia or obsession, but to become available to the symbolic dimension of life. To ask gently, what is this trying to show me? When you approach your experience with curiosity rather than resistance, the unconscious responds. Dreams deepen. Coincidences increase. The invisible dialogue becomes visible. Life begins to feel orchestrated again, not by control, but by connection. But this transformation demands patience. The psyche, like nature, moves in seasons. It doesn't rebuild overnight. And this brings us to a critical question, one that determines whether your renewal becomes real or remains superficial. What happens if we refuse to listen? If we try to rebuild too soon? The greatest danger after collapse isn't the fall itself. It's the urge to rebuild too quickly, to return to the illusion of who you were. You patch the cracks, reorganize your days, smile for the world, and tell yourself it's over now. You post pictures of strength, repeat mantras about resilience, and convince everyone, even yourself, that you've moved on. But deep down, the foundation is still trembling. The storm passed, yet its message remains unread. What you rebuilt might look new, but it carries the same invisible architecture, the same patterns of fear, avoidance, and control. Carl Jung warned that when we ignore the voice of the unconscious, we risk falling into what he called neurosis, a kind of spiritual suffocation. He wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In other words, when we refuse to face our pain consciously, it doesn't disappear. It hides. It seeps into our bodies as fatigue, into our relationships as projection, into our minds as anxiety. We can restore the appearance of order, but not its meaning. The outer life looks repaired, but the inner one remains divided. And when renewal is forced, it becomes repetition. That's why so many people rebuild their lives only to fall again. They move to new cities, but carry the same loneliness. They enter new relationships but repeat the same cycles of mistrust and dependency. They chase success but never feel fulfilled. The structure changed, but the soul didn't. The same unexamined wounds, the need to be loved, the fear of rejection, the obsession with control, still run the show. Jung compared this to circling the same mountain, believing you're progressing when, in truth, you're only walking the same path from a different angle. The unconscious, however, is patient. It doesn't punish, it educates. When you rebuild without integration, life eventually brings you back to the same lesson. It's not cruelty, it's compassion in disguise. The self will dismantle everything built on falseness until authenticity becomes your only option. What breaks repeatedly isn't life's cruelty, it's its consistency. The universe refuses to let you live divided. So, the collapse wasn't failure, it was mercy. A fierce, devastating mercy. Life was showing you that something inauthentic had to die. The parts of you driven by fear, approval, or pretense were never sustainable. The fall is how the psyche removes what your willpower never could. It is grace in disguise, an exorcism of falseness. You might not have chosen the ending consciously, but your soul did. It knew that surviving on autopilot was no longer living. Jung wrote in the archetypes and the collective unconscious, man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health. Those words carry a paradoxical kind of hope. What if your pain isn't a detour, but the path itself? What if the descent, the loneliness, the confusion, the loss, is not a curse but a crucible? Without descent, there is no depth. Without conflict, no growth. Without shadow, no light. It's in the valley, not on the mountaintop, that we integrate the scattered parts of who we are. The descent teaches what comfort never could. It humbles the ego, softens offenses, and burns away illusion. You stop performing strength and start embodying truth. You realize that authenticity isn't born from triumph, but from the willingness to feel everything, even the ache. Jung often said that only the wounded physician heals. It's the one who has walked through their own darkness who can finally live, love, and lead from wholeness. And yet, here lies the hardest part. To begin again after such collapse feels impossible. Standing among ruins, you wonder how to trust life again, how to rebuild without repeating, how to open your heart after it's been broken by your own illusions. It takes more than optimism. It takes courage of a sacred kind. The courage to rebuild not on the old ground, but on new soil, soil fertilized by loss, watered by surrender, and illuminated by awareness. Because what comes after fall isn't restoration, it's resurrection. And resurrection doesn't look like returning to who you were. It looks like becoming someone who can never again pretend to be asleep. You rise not as a polished version of your past self, but as someone remade by truth. The storm didn't destroy you. It stripped you down to what's indestructible. Still, even with this understanding, one question remains, the one that echoes in every soul that has known the breaking. If falling apart is part of healing, where does one find the courage to start again? Jung described the path of rebirth not as a single miracle, but as a rhythm, a sacred pulse between descent and return. He called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are. It begins when the outer story collapses and the soul demands authenticity. The point is not to escape the darkness, but to move through it consciously, letting each stage refine you into truth. Individuation is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It asks that you meet yourself fully, without disguise, without performance. And while no two journeys are identical, Jung outlined a pattern, a map of transformation that has guided countless souls back to themselves. Recognition. The first step is brutal honesty, to admit the collapse instead of covering it. You stop pretending that everything is fine. You name what has died. The role, the relationship, the version of yourself that no longer lives here. Grief becomes your first act of courage. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. You can't awaken by bypassing the wound. You awaken by entering it. Don't rush to fix it. Sit among the ruins until you can hear what they're trying to say. This is a descent, the necessary disorientation before clarity. Integration. Once you've named what has fallen, the next step is to face what you avoided. The shadow. These are the parts of you exiled by shame, fear, or guilt. They appear as irritations in others, projections in relationships, or strange impulses you can't explain. Jung saw the shadow not as evil, but as unacknowledged energy. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. Write, dream, pray, reflect, bring what's hidden into dialogue. The goal is not to conquer the shadow, but to befriend it, to make peace with the parts of you that have been waiting to be seen. Integration is the act of remembering who you are beneath the persona. Conscious action. Awareness without embodiment changes nothing. Once you've listened to the unconscious, you must act in alignment with it, one small, truthful step at a time. This isn't about grand reinvention. It's about integrity in motion. Make choices that reflect your new awareness, even if they scare you. Say no when your body says no. Rest when you're tired instead of proving your worth through exhaustion. Rebuild not from fear, but from truth. Jung compared this to the function of the transcendent, the psychic bridge between opposites, where the conscious and unconscious cooperate. When you begin to act from that center, you stop reacting to life and start co-creating with it. Legacy. The final step is transmutation, turning suffering into light. Every pain you've survived carries wisdom meant not only for you, but for others. When you share what you've learned, you transform your wounds into medicine. The act of giving meaning to pain completes the circle of rebirth. Jung believed that individuation ultimately serves a collective. As one soul becomes more conscious, it illuminates a path for many. Your story, once filled with ashes, becomes a lantern for someone still lost in the dark. This path isn't about positive thinking. It's not spiritual gloss or forced optimism. It's soul work, raw, humbling, transformative. It asks for presence over perfection, honesty over comfort. As you walk it, something greater begins to move with you, what Jung called the self, the divine core of the psyche. When consciousness and unconsciousness start to cooperate, life itself becomes a therapist. You begin to sense a rhythm again, moments of grace appearing where there was once only despair. But even as this inner light begins to grow, Jung warned that there are forces that can pull you back, subtle shadows that seduce you into illusion, comfort, and control. And so the question remains, poised like a threshold before the final transformation. Even on this sacred path, how do we avoid being drawn back into the sleep we've just awakened from? Every rebirth carries its own hidden temptations. After surviving the storm, after the silence begins to soften, there comes a fragile light, and with it, the egos whisper, I did it. I've healed. I've mastered this. It feels good, almost holy, to rise from the ashes. But Jung warned that this is precisely where danger hides. The moment the ego identifies with the power of transformation itself, the sacred process becomes contaminated. He called this state inflation, when the ego, dazzled by its own progress, mistakes itself for the self. What was once humility becomes pride disguised as enlightenment. You no longer serve the light. You start performing it. Inflation is seductive because it feels like confidence, but it's really a return to illusion, a subtler form of the same old pattern. Control. You replace external validation with spiritual validation, chasing purity instead of presence. You may start to see yourself as above the world you once suffered in, detached, superior, invulnerable. The danger is that this false transcendence cuts you off from life's pulse. You stop listening to others. You stop learning. You confuse awareness with arrival. And as Jung wrote in the archetypes in the collective unconscious, the greater the light, the greater the shadow. The higher you rise without grounding, the deeper the fall that follows. Other traps follow close behind. One of them is isolation, the belief that now, having awakened, you no longer need anyone. You retreat from the world, protecting your newfound peace like fragile glass. But individuation was never meant to be a solitary throne. It is a dialogue between the inner and the outer, between the soul and collective. Without connection, wisdom becomes echo. Another is a savior complex, the compulsion to fix others, to project your own healing onto those who haven't yet begun. It's a noble disguise for avoidance, focusing on their wounds so you don't have to face the one still healing in you. Jung warned that the shadow often reappears dressed as virtue. The moment you think you're above it, it slips back through the side door, whispering, save them. Then there's regression, the pull to return to old comforts when the next layer of transformation emerges, because growth isn't linear. The psyche unfolds in spirals, not straight lines. Old wounds resurface, not to punish you, but to be seen from higher ground. When this happens, the ego panics. It says, I thought I was done with this. But healing isn't about finishing. It's about continuing. The work never ends. It deepens. So, how do you stay free from these traps? Jung's antidote was simple but profound. Humility and relationship. Stay connected. To art that softens your edges. To nature that reminds you of your smallness. To people who see you clearly and love you without worship. Ground your insights in service, not superiority. The more light you carry, the more necessary your roots become. Without them, illumination burns instead of warms. Healing isn't about becoming untouchable. It's about becoming real. To integrate is to hold both, the divine and the human, the eternal and the imperfect, without rejecting either. The ego wants perfection. The soul wants wholeness. And wholeness requires paradox. To be both fragile and strong, both broken and blessed, both shadow and light. When you reach this balance, something extraordinary begins to awaken. The self, that silent, luminous center Jung described, rises not as an achievement, but as a presence. You no longer chase meaning. You become it. You no longer seek God outside. You feel its pulse inside your own humanity. And that is the true secret of the journey. Not escaping your contradictions, but embodying them. Because when you finally accept both the light and the shadow, both your weakness and your radiance, something extraordinary awakens within you. There comes a morning when the storm no longer defines you. The light touches your face, and for the first time in what feels like years, you breathe without the weight of what went wrong. The silence that used to echo with fear now feels full, almost sacred. You sit with your coffee or by the window, and something inside you whispers, "This is what peace feels like." It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself with grand revelation. It's quiet. The kind of quiet that holds everything you've lived through and transforms into calm. You realize that rebirth doesn't come from fighting the storm or escaping it. It comes from standing in the rain long enough to understand it. You're no longer trying to rebuild the old life. You know now that what fell apart wasn't meant to survive. To begin again isn't about returning to who you were. It's about honoring what the fall revealed. Every loss, every failure, every heartbreak was an initiation, a sacred undoing that carved space of the self to breathe. Jung wrote that life must be lived again and again. It must be one anew each day. He meant that consciousness isn't a trophy. It's a daily practice of remembering who you truly are. You win life not once, but every time you choose presence over numbness, truth over illusion, and love over fear. And so you begin to live differently. You no longer wake up asking what you need to achieve, but how you want to be. The mirror doesn't scare you anymore because you recognize the person looking back. You see the strength in your softness, the wisdom in your scars, the beauty in your imperfection. What once felt like fragments now form a mosaic. Uneven, yes, but luminous. The cracks are where the light gathers. The pain that once hollowed you out has become the vessel through which compassion flows. You find yourself listening to others differently, not to respond, but to understand. Your silence has become empathy. Your wounds have become language. To live from this place is to embody paradox. You are both fragile and powerful, both human and divine, both the wound and the healer. Jung called this state wholeness, not perfection, but harmony between opposites. You no longer reject the darkness. You see how it shaped your light. You no longer resent the fall. You see how it deepened your roots. You carry your history, not as a burden, but as proof that resurrection is real. In the archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung wrote that the self is both the goal and the guide of transformation, the silent center that pulls us toward meaning even when we resist. And you feel that now, the pull is something ancient, wordless, eternal. It moves through you like a current, the sense that life is not happening to you, but through you, you start to see meaning in everything again, in the way sunlight hits the floor, in a stranger's smile, in the rhythm of your own breath. What once seemed random now feels orchestrated by something wise and loving. This is a quiet rebirth of the self. No fireworks, no applause, just a slow, steady unfolding. You realize that peace was never something to find. It was what remained when the noise stopped. It's not the absence of struggle, but the acceptance of what is. You no longer need to chase light, because you are the light, shaped, refined, and made whole by the dark that once broke you. The person who thought everything was over has become the vessel through which something eternal speaks. And in that realization, life becomes sacred again. You see beauty where you once saw chaos. You feel gratitude where there once was grief. You stop searching for meaning and begin living it. You're no longer at war with your story. You are its peace. The circle closes, not with an ending, but with beginning. The descent, the collapse, the silence, they were never detours. They were the path itself. The light that now radiates from within you isn't new. It was there all along, waiting to be remembered. The end was never the end. It was the soul's way of beginning again. Comment below. I choose to begin again.